So climate change, or climate scientists rather, have warned that the flooding in KwaZulu-Natal is just the start of many more extreme weather events to come. Africa Regional Climate Change Coordinator at the UN Environment Programme, Dr. Richard Munang, says the message for Africa is simple. Increasing action is an urgent imperative. Dr. Munang joins us now further to discuss the implications of climate change for the continent that contributes the least to all this. Thank you very much for availing yourself this morning. How should we understand the events that we are seeing, not just in South Africa, Mozambique, Madagascar, Malawi?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. The reality of climate change is actually with us, and this is no longer an abstract issue. And with the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment report, called the Assessment Report, it clearly shows that we are almost just 20 years away from hitting 1.5 degrees, and that even though that is the case, Africa is warming faster than the rest of the world. And when you look at the events that are happening in Southern African region, is actually attributed to the changing climate, because what the reports have been saying or telling us consistently are that with warming, we are going to have more floods, we are going to have more extreme events of droughts, and these are just the manifestations of what we are going to see in the long run. And these are the biophysical sides. But there is also the other side, which is the socio-economic side, because when the floods come, they displace people, they destroy infrastructure. But people are more vulnerable to this because they are not able to move to areas in which they are supposed to be in, because they lack the resources that are needed. And that socio-economic dimension is actually what is exacerbating this vulnerability that we are seeing today in the continent.
Doc, where are we drawing our research from? I guess I ask in light of a report that was done by Carbon Brief. You can go online to access it, and the study looked at 100 of the most highly cited climate research papers over the past 5 years. Fewer than 1% of the authors were based on the continent. It speaks of systematic bias, where one study noted that a lot of the understanding of climate change is biased towards cooler climates because it's mainly carried out by scientists who live in the global north in cold climates.
The reality is that science doesn't know black and white. Science is science, and the world is an interconnected space. And Africa is part of the global community, where the latest science that has stated came from. It's a United Nations report called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that brings scientists from across the entire world, including from in Africa. The fact that very little research has been done in Africa doesn't necessarily mean that there is no research that has been done about Africa. And the science has been quite very, very consistent. Actually, I did my PhD 11 years ago on climate change and Africa. And actually, from the data then, it corroborates with the data that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is actually bringing out. But I think the bigger question should be, with what we know, even if you look at what our mothers in communities have been telling us, the amount of rain that they used to have 10 years ago has changed. There are more droughts today than there were in 1950 and 1960. So this anecdotal information is actually telling enough that we are seeing the changing climate from the experiences that we have had before and the experiences that we're having today. So that means we must take action to be able to reverse this challenging moment in which we are living in today.
What action do we take when we contribute the least to the problem?
The reality is, when your house is on fire, you have to put it out. And to do so, Africa has contributed the least, as you've rightly said, just roughly 2 to 3% of global emissions, but it is the most vulnerable because of low socioeconomic base. Very few people have the opportunity to put food on the table. Very few people have the opportunity to put more money in more pockets. What needs to be done, it needs to be done from 3 perspectives. Firstly, we must appreciate African governments for being the biggest continent in the entire globe that have ratified what is called the Paris Climate Change Agreement and put together plans called nationally determined contributions. 52 out of 54 countries have done so, and they have also increased the ambition more than any other part of the world. That's one. 2 is, we now need to turn these policies into reality that can make meaningful change in the common person's life across every community in the continent. And for that to happen, there needs to be investments in actions, especially the agro value chain. 60% of people in the continent are employed in the entire agro sector. But how can we be able then to leverage simple solutions in communities, like adding value to dry vegetables, to dry their corn, what we call simple climate action solar dryers that the young people can be engaged to produce, and they need incentives. And these incentives need to be given in terms of tax incentives or in terms of financial incentives, which governments are already doing, but that's not enough. But these incentives need to be channeled through structures that are accessible to the informal sector, like communal cooperatives, where young people can then be able to access financial opportunities and also get the requisite training to then be able to tap into these opportunities as they address the challenges that are found within communities. And the last one is climate change needs to become part and parcel of the educational curriculum. It needs to be taught in school not just as a problem, but as a business opportunity. Because I was speaking today, in the entire African continent, about 90% of the population depends on charcoal. And this charcoal is not only causing indoor pollution that is killing over 700,000 Africans each and every year, but it's also an opportunity that can be tapped into because it presents a market of $20 billion. And so if just training young people to turn agricultural waste into fuel briquettes will be creating an opportunity that is a business investment opportunity, but at the same time reducing the indoor pollution. So making this become part and parcel of the educational curriculum and make this part of national development will turn climate challenges into opportunities.
Absolutely, Doc. I guess the question on, how the research is conducted, I think there's a saying about anything about us without us. There's something that is not right there, and I guess that then leads to this question of indigenous knowledge systems that have existed on the continent for eons. How are we tapping into that, to mitigate some of these climate change factors?
You can only be able to address any challenge by building on what works in the areas in which that problem is happening. What do I mean by this? Indigenous knowledge must become part and parcel of how climate resilience of communities is being built. And if you look across the continent, if I take just western part of Africa, there is an indigenous knowledge called Zai, which is a very simple technique that communities have used to dig holes when it rains. It captures the water and then rejuvenate the water retention capability, and this has resulted in agricultural use up to 500%. If that is not built on, there is absolutely no way in the Sahel that agricultural production can be increased. It is the same in other communities across the entire African continent. So the point then is indigenous knowledge must become part and parcel of how climate resilience development can be fostered across the entire continent. But more importantly is the fact that the climate is changing across the continent today doesn't mean that communities are not taking action. We see our mothers in communities actually using organic manure that is actually produced from the communities in which they live. They are using different agricultural techniques, intercropping, agroforestry. These techniques, they know them, they use them. So the best way is to build on what works. And it's only by also listening to these communities and learning from what they've done that we can be able to foster a transformational climate action for people and planet. So your point is very correct, and indigenous knowledge must take center stage to then be able to move forward. And that means one aspect, we must learn from the communities that are coping with this changing climate and understand their gaps and fill those gaps, because one aspect is we do not do development for people. People do development for themselves, and what we must always do is to facilitate the process.